Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. I think we've still got one of the panelists to log in by the looks of things. I haven't got, because as soon as I get, as soon as we see James, we can get going, can't we? All right. So just a little bit of housekeeping, just to say that if you have some questions, could you just direct them to the icon at the bottom, the questions, the Q&A icon at the bottom. Just type them in there. I think the panelists will be very comprehensive if you just, if you give them the chance. A lot of your questions will be covered, but if there's anything you'd like to ask at the end, then please do. We've got about 10 minutes. There's a huge amount to cover, so I don't want to delay by doing too long introductions, but just to say a huge welcome to Mark Schuster, our new Fire Technical Officer, and to Dr. Jenny Scott, our Sustainability Program Leader. And I think that because Mark's going to kick off with his, and because, as I say, that it is a very big subject, lots to cover, rather than do a big sort of personal intro, I think Mark can introduce himself and get on with here talking about his subjects. Sorry, we have somebody. And then Jenny and James will be introducing you to the sim table. Okay, so if I will mute myself and let you take over, Mark, if that's okay.
Going on. No, I'm in.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mark Schuster, and
I sent a message to Lindy to ask me to promote me to panelist.
I've come all the way down from Roma in Queensland, and for the last 15 years...
Anyway, we have a moment. Mark's doing his thing right now, so
trying to work out
trying to sort that out.
How would I say?
I'll try and find my panelist now.
The asset protection.
So I should be there in a moment. Just give me a moment. Chance to find this invite email.
Just a bit hard at the moment. Okay, I think we're right now. Anyway, what my role is as the Bushfire Technical Officer is both the asset protection side of fire for council, and that houses, properties and people, of course, #1 priority, and the ecological outcomes. And I've found over 15 years of working for national parks, in local government, in all my different roles as a bushfire consultant also, but to try and align fire management for both the asset protection side, houses and property and people, and the ecological outcomes of our ecological communities is a hell of a job. And we're actually walking on a tightrope, so to speak. And particularly in Ku-ring-gai, we're really walking on that tightrope because we have fragmented bushland areas, lovely bushland areas, as I've well come to see in the last 2 months I've been down here. But we've also got many, many houses right up against those bushland areas. So my role takes both sides in the asset protection and the ecological outcomes. Just as a bit of a background, I was trained as an ecologist, as a bushfire ecologist for the last 20 years. And yeah, I've got into the asset protection side in the last 10 years, working in Queensland, helping them with their asset protection planning. I'm basically an ecologist and a planner. They're my main roles. So that's told you a little bit about the two sides of things, asset protection, houses on one side, houses and properties, and our ecological communities, about 8 to 10 of them at least we've got in Ku-ring-gai. So how do we put the two together in the best way, the ecological needs? I've only got a short time, but I want to tell you a little bit about what's called the fire regime. That's really the crux of everything in our ecological communities with our plants and animals. Now, there's 4 or 5 different elements of the fire regime, and I'll tell you a little bit about each one. And the first one's the extent of a fire. And by that, I mean the spatial extent, not just the total area, but within the area that's burnt, the percentage that is actually burnt. You might have a wildfire goes through, it burns 100% of the area. But if you want to put in a small cool burn, or like the Aboriginal people would have done with their cultural burns, often it's the Mosaic Burn, which might burn, say, 20 to 40% and leave 60 to 70% of the actual land area untouched, ready for another burn. So often they're low intensity burns. A wildfire often is medium intensity through to very high intensity or catastrophic. So the reason, I suppose, that planned burns, and I'll talk a little bit about planned burns further on, is that if you can get planned burns in, you can reduce the intensity. Now that's the next side of the fire regime. First one is extent, second one's intensity of a fire. As I said, putting in a planned burn, you could have a low to moderate intensity burn. A wildfire is often in pretty severe to catastrophic conditions, and that's a high intensity burn right up the top. So intensity is the next one. Seasonality. Often some people might try and get planned burns in the winter, early spring, late spring, but certainly not in midsummer unless you have sufficient soil moisture, and that's another critical component. So seasonality. A lot of animals, particularly invertebrates, which is the other 99% of all our fauna, the unseen, the invertebrates, they bed down in winter. So it's not a good idea to have a burn in midwinter. So the seasonality of fires is another aspect of the fire regime. A really important one is frequency. Now, in northern New South Wales, for instance, they've had 2 infrequent fires, and a lot of the areas become very mesic. So that's been a problem there, infrequent fires. But in other areas, say in the Sydney Basin, very frequent fires. So that's another issue, too frequent. Now, there's those 3 or 4 factors, and the interplay between frequency and burn intensity is so important. There's been a lot of research done in the last decade on trying to work out if you have one severe fire, will it next be followed by another severe fire? Is that the way it works? Or if you can get a few low intensity planned burns in, will that alter the fire, how would I say, interplay between frequency and the intensity? So that's a really important aspect. Now, plants and animals differ in their needs with fires, the fire response from both plants and animals. Plants have basically 2 types of response. One, seeding. You need a fire sometimes to seed Hakeas and Banksias to open the seed pod, and you've seen that no doubt walking through fire post-burn areas. Some animals actually escape a fire, others go down into hollows. Other plants, of course, they have lignotubers, so the fire response in eucalypts is pretty good. Some have lignotubers, others have epicormic shoots you'll see on those trees after a fire's come through. So there's different evolutionary responses from the Australian flora and fauna. And it's basically almost trying to tailor-make fire for our area. Now I'll talk a little bit about Ku-ring-gai. Where I come from in central Queensland up in the sandstone belt is very easy. We could put in a planned burn, just let it run because we had very few assets. Some of those planned burns were 20 to 40,000 hectares in size. So no worries with the asset side. You could put in a fire just on its ecological prescription side when you want that fire to tailor make it for biodiversity. So very easy there. Now, as I've come to find in Ku-ring-gai, I've walked a lot of the streets in Ku-ring-gai now to have a look at the fragmented bushscape we have. It is a big issue. And the other really addition we have to that is houses. 32 to 34% of all our housing stock resides within 50 to 100 metres of that bushland interface. So that's what makes that the knife edge, the razor's edge, so to speak, between the asset protection side of fire and the ecological side so important. How do we factor both those sides in and get it working together? And I'm just giving you a few ideas and you'll be able to tell me when we meet next. I want to talk about types of fires. A lot of people think a bushfire is a bushfire, but it's not that way at all. There's basically, you can categorise them into 3 different types. You can have a patch fire. You might have a 2 to 5 hectare patch of bushland, and you'll have a small intensity fire, which is quite patchy. We call that a patch fire. Next type of fire is a landscape fire. It will run across the landscape, and no doubt James and Jenny with their sim table in the next, in a few minutes time, will show you a landscape fire, which runs across the landscape. Then there's the ones that Australia's getting quite worried about. Even ourselves in Queensland for the last 2 fire seasons had some pretty drastic fires, which many in southern Australia call mega fires. It's a different category to a landscape fire. A landscape fire often depends on fuel, and your amounts of fuel will drive that fire, but a mega fire can drive itself. It's driven primarily by winds and very drought factors, very dry climate promoting it, but then it promotes its own climate, macro and microclimate actually, and will generate itself a fire. They're the ones we should really worry about. As I said, I've started wandering about through Ku-ring-gai, many beautiful trees. But if we did have a canopy fire, it would take out most of the shire. I can assure you that. That's not just me being a pessimist at all. It's a reality. And these mega fires are the ones we really have to watch in the future, as well as landscape fires. So there's 3 types of fires. Now, one of the things when you actually meet me physically, if we did the overall fuel hazard monitoring, is that I'm going to talk about fuels and also hazard reduction burning. Is hazard reduction burning always the answer? No, I can tell you. It has a role, and it only has a role. If we had a mega fire, it makes little difference because everything, given enough heat, will burn. And the amounts of fuel is often a minor factor when you have a mega fire. But with a patch fire or a smaller landscape fire, yes, fuel does matter, the amounts of fuel. Now, most people will be surprised that 2 to 3 years after a hazard reduction burn or after a wildfire, you'll have fuel building up to accumulating to such a level that a fire can run through again. So that aspect is really important. Fuel build up over time, and it sort of builds up in that sort of mode, not an exponential mode, but a gradual sort of curvilinear mode. And once it reaches a peak, it stays there. So you might have a patch of bush which mightn't have burnt for 5 to 6 years. Give it another 15 years, it could have very much the same amount of fuel. So most people think it just keeps building and building until infinitesimally. That's not right. It will reach a stasis, and then that fuel is taken back into the soil. Now, what we should mention is that we can do all the hazard reduction burning we like, but embers will always be produced by wildfires, and they will travel a long time. I do want to emphasise that in Ku-ring-gai, no one is safe from ember attack. I've seen them travel over 10 kilometres, and that's to the width of Ku-ring-gai. Given a wind, paperbark trees, types of trees, yes, anything can burn. Fitting the fires to the landscape. We can almost, part of my role is to tailor-make our burns, that's our hazard reduction burns, to different parts of the landscape. I mentioned fire regimes. Some parts of the landscape might need a fire for ecological purpose every 2 to 8 years. To keep it fairly open, a grassy understory, if you kept fire out 10 to 12 years, it would promote shrubs. Now, I went the other day into Brown's Forest, the Hay Dalrymple Reserve it's called, and in that reserve in there, they put a low to moderate intensity fire in, and it promoted really high wattle undergrowth, virtually a monoculture of wattle. That's what we don't want. Now, those types of, say the blue gum high forest actually likes a very high intensity fire every, say, 18 to 30 years. But how do we get that type of fire in when we had a fragmented landscape surrounded by houses? How do we put the fire for ecological outcomes into a fragmented landscape, even though for seeding in these tall eucalypts, they often need a very intense fire? That's something I've got to think about, and others have to think about also. Cultural burning. Now, as you can see, I'm just mentioning some of these things to you, which James and Jenny can take up, or you can come visit me or I'll visit you. Actually, cultural burning. I've worked with Aboriginal people in Queensland on their firescapes. Actually, cultural burning is often a low to moderate intensity, very low intensity burn in a very small patch. Now, on the outskirts and surrounds of Sydney, we're stuck with very large areas. Cultural burning certainly has its place, but it isn't the only method. We can incorporate cultural burning into our tool of fire management, I suppose you call it, and it's a very important tool. The Aboriginal people didn't burn everywhere. They burned along their pathways. They wanted to keep them clear. If you didn't have too many clothes on wandering about, you wanted it pretty clear too. And also for game, for kangaroos, that type of thing, for collecting game, they used it. But they didn't burn often in the high forests and the high ranges. Lightning started those fires. So yes, cultural burning has a big role. and you can't just take the cultural burning that occurs in the savannas of Cape York Peninsula or Arnhem Land straight down and translate them into the Sydney bushscapes. We'd have some problems if we did that. We have to look for records of how our wonderful Aboriginal communities did the burns early on in pre-European days. So yeah, we're trying to amass some of that data, what's left of it, and resurrect it. And there's a wonderful program called Fire Sticks in New South Wales, which is attempting to do that. So it's alloying all those things. So yes, I've just introduced myself as Mark or Skippy, the Fire Ranger or Fire Technical Officer for Ku-ring-gai, and I'm there for everyone's needs to talk about fire. Come and look at your place, the back of your place. How is fire best tailor-made for Ku-ring-gai? So, yep, that's part of my role, or a large part of my role. I love it, love doing it. I'm going to hand over to James and Jenny now for their part. Thank you all. Good.
Right. So, thanks very much, Mark. You put in there a bit of information that will certainly be useful with our presentation. What we're going to do is show you the sim table by simulation. Normally we do this in a workshop where we have people standing around the table and physically experiencing the 3D element of the sim table as it burns across Ku-ring-gai. But of course with COVID that's not been possible, so we've developed it into an online presentation of which James is the master controller. So what we'll do is we'll get James to bring up the vision of Ku-ring-gai, and if I am correct, we'll be looking at the north side of Ku-ring-gai. Whoops, I just got, yep, so the north side of Ku-ring-gai. And there you can see we're looking from over towards Hornsby, Asquith, to the east through North Wahroonga, North Turramurra, across to St Ives and Terry Hills. Now you'll see there's a purple square there. I don't know, James, if we can zoom in a little more on that purple square. That's better. So we can get a bit of a more detailed look. So you can see the landscape and how the incised valleys go quite deep into the urban area. And this is what carries the fire and makes so many houses on our interface at risk. So what we're going to do is we're going to get James to simulate a fire. Built into this simulation is already the effect of fire behaviour in terms of the way terrain affects the fire run, the way the vegetation, we've got Ku-ring-gai's vegetation layers in there, and so that will also be reflective of how the fire runs. We have it set at the moment, we can control the weather in this particular case. So we've got it set at very low humidity below 10%. We've got a temperature of around 35 degrees, and we can also control the wind speed and direction. You'll see up in the left-hand corner is a little blue wheel, and that allows James to increase the wind speed and change the direction of the wind. So at the moment, we'll start the wind speed. For this simulation, we say it's a Tuesday morning. We've got to think about what we'd be doing typically on a Tuesday, where we would be, if we've got kids, where they might be, if we've got pets or people in the household with disabilities or who are dependent on others for transport, how they might cope if a fire comes. And what we're going to do is we're going to say that sometime during the night there was a lightning strike and it started a fire just up in that northwest corner of our view here. So I'll get James to start the fire. Oh, it's going pretty fast, James.
Oops.
We can actually control the speed of the fire, by the way. So James has lit a fire. It's going at about 64 times the speed it would. And you can see a counter down there on the bottom, counting down the hours and minutes, or counting up the hours and minutes since this fire started. So given the conditions that we're in, this fire has very rapidly established itself. Now, normally we'd have the RFS with us and they would be telling you what they would be doing. We'd also probably have the police and national parks, and they would be explaining what they would be doing at this point in time. So what we need to do, get people to do, is to think about what they would be doing. If a fire had started in this location, what might be your plan? What are you going to do? When's your trigger to leave, etc., etc. So as the fire progresses during the day, we're now nearly and coming up for an hour and a half into this fire. As is typical on a summer's day, the wind speed picks up. So James is going to pick up the wind speed. It's coming from the northwest, and we're now getting up to a gusting to around 50 kilometres an hour. So as the wind speed picks up, so does the potential for embers to start running ahead of this fire. So as the fire comes up and crests onto ridges, it then gets picked up, embers get picked up by the wind and blown forward, and they ignite new fires ahead of the fire front. So what looked like a fairly slow-moving or moderately slow-moving fire in the first place is now advancing much more quickly, because it's creating a whole new fire front, and in fact several different fire fronts. And that's why it's progressing across the landscape much faster than thought. Now, the RFS might have had a watch and act alert out. They're probably now, for areas in the northern suburbs, especially North Turramurra, probably putting out emergency alerts. They would be wanting people to be long gone out of that area now. If they're not long gone and they're going to stay and defend, then they need to understand really well how defendable their house is. And let me tell you, a lot of people try and stay and defend houses that are not defendable. The best thing you can do there, if you're not going to increase the resilience of the house, is to make sure it's very well insured and you leave early. And for most people in areas where there's one road in, one road out, leave early is the only option. You don't want to be caught there. So we can see now, as the fire is progressing, we're now 3 hours into this fire, and the wind speed is now picking up again. It's the middle of the day, and as you know, by about the middle of the day, those hot winds coming in out of the centre of Australia can really pick up and gust quite hard. So as it moves more quickly because of the wind, again, so does the spotting increase in distance. So we might have had a spotting distance of 1 to 2 kilometres at lower wind speeds, but at these higher wind speeds, the spotting can go 3, 4, 5, who knows how far, because in the past, in Canberra, etc., and Black Saturday, there were embers being blown 10 and 20 kilometres ahead of the fire front. Now, as Mark rightly pointed out, the majority of houses, 92% in fact, are lost through ember attack. 92% was the figure from last Black Summer's research. Now, a lot of the fire control strategy that we put in place are actually to control radiant heat. They don't do much for ember attack. What does do a lot for ember attack is strengthening your house against embers getting in. And that's far more effective than an APZ or an HR burn, because those things, as Mark said, are really only effective up to about a severe fire level. Once you get into severe, extreme, catastrophic, those HR burns and APZs are not going to make really any difference at all. And if you're not sure about that, just go back to what Shane Fitzsimmons said last summer. It was very widely publicised. So now we can see the fire front is pretty much all the way across the north side of Ku-ring-gai. The emergency services would be hitting this as hard as they can, but they would be into trying to get people out of the way. They would no longer be fighting this fire, because it has gone beyond that point where they can possibly hope to control it. What they'd be doing now is trying to limit the losses. So we have a program called Climate Wise Communities, which allows you to go through a whole process of understanding your risk, of understanding your household's ability to respond in an emergency like this, looking at your property so that your property, you can evaluate it. Is it worth staying and defending? Is it realistic that it could be defended? Or is a leave early option the only option to take? And in most cases, that will be the answer. Then what can you do to make sure that your house has the best chance of still being there when you get back, so that any recovery is much more quickly done for you because you've made your house resilient to ember attack, so the chances are that it will survive an extreme event. And then you need to talk to your neighbours. The last section in this is about talking to your neighbours about increasing the ability for the whole neighbourhood to be more resilient. Because if one house catches fire, then it might set fire to the next house because of radiant heat. So the most effective things that you can do to conserve your property, to protect your life, lies in your hands. You've got to be able to make your property and your lifestyle as resilient as possible. And the very last tool that we have in this suite of tools for your planning is one that's called the What If tool. It was created by RMIT and the Bushfire CRC from research they did into Black Saturday and all the things that stopped bushfire plans from working on the day. And the less than 5% of people who had a plan, nearly all of them reported that the plan didn't work on the day. And it was because that they hadn't thought of these contingencies that can happen for them to include in their planning. So what we do here on this spin the wheel exercise is we have the most common ones that fouled up people's plans in Black Saturday. And if you spin the wheel, it will come up with one of these options. And you can go through the whole lot and test your plan to see how is it covering this eventuality. So if you're unsure whether to leave, what do you do to make that decision? What information do you need? And if you put that decision off, continually put that decision off, the chances of being caught, isolated in your house are quite high. And as the fire brigades say, when they're in those areas where there is only one road in and one road out, they're drawing their people out. They don't want to risk their lives. So the fact that you will likely be on your own is very high. So you need to very well plan for how you would deal with that. So having a trigger for when to leave is really, really important. And so all the information about how to make that decision of when to leave is included in Climate-Wise Communities. It then gives you links to the RFS Bushfire Survival Plan or the Red Cross planning. They do a very good one for all different types of extreme weather events, or the SES for the storm events. So this is a very rapid scenario that we've given you. Normally we spend an hour on this and go through it in detail. So if there are questions, by all means, please ask them. But I do commend that you look at Climate-Wise Communities and consider that kind of scenario that we just showed you with the sim table as the kind of thing you need to plan for, because they're the destructive fires. They're the ones we saw last summer, and they happened last summer, and they have happened before, and they'll happen again. And Ku-ring-gai was just really ridiculously lucky last summer that we didn't have a major fire in our area. So really this kind of planning for anyone who lives anywhere near the bushland is an essential part of bushfire preparedness. So council does its bit with what it can do around fuel reduction and clearing APZs, but really they're not going to count for much in this level of event. what you do on your own property will be much more important to the outcome. So that's, I think, pretty much covered that.
Can I just add something extra, Jenny?
Yes.
Most people may not realise, but an Australian standard for construction in bushfire-prone areas came out in 1989 it was, and most of our houses are built prior to that. So it's just to let people know that many of the houses at the urban bushland interface may not be built to a sufficient standard to withstand even what we call a BEL 29. Now, there's something called BEL that's really important. I didn't explain that before. It's bushfire attack level on a structure, and it can vary from a BEL low, which is still pretty hard on a person's body, right up to BEL flame zone, which is where flames engulf the building. The radiant heat is about 40,000 kilowatts per square metre, and that's unbearable. Of course, you would die in those circumstances. But many of our housing stock is built between BEL low and BEL 19, pretty low on the scale. So the retrofitting scheme that council has, and retrofitting your house, is a really almost a mandatory requirement if you're living on the bushland interface. It is just so important. As Jenny said, don't rely on those APZs, because even ember attack alone will cut through an APZ like a hot knife through cheese easily. So yeah, there's that aspect to consider. So, but all of us are there to assist you all. Thanks for that.
And I'll just add just very quickly to one last thing to do with the Climate-Wise Communities website. We do have a Ask an Expert function there as well. So if after the webinar you have additional questions, could be about your property, it could be how to make a plan, it could be about doing retrofit or renovation, or any number of things, bushfire, storm, flood, heatwave related, you can submit the question through the Climate-Wise Communities website via the Ask an Expert function. And I'll send a link to the website in the chat in a moment. So.
Well, thanks very much. Thank you, James, for that. And I think people will want to take advantage of that. Thank you, Jenny and Mark. It was very compelling, I must say. That's actually the first time I've seen the sim table. I know that Jenny and James have been doing some fantastic stuff in sex. It's an award-winning program that they have put together there, and it's just so interesting. But you guys just whizzed through it. I mean, I can't believe you've got through all that information in such a short time. I thought we would still be talking about it, and we've only had really one question. So if we've got some time now, if people have got some questions, surely this must have brought up some issues for you. If you want to type them into the Q&A at the bottom there, James is very happy to answer them, or we can direct them, direct the questions to Mark in particular if you want to, or to Jenny. So if anybody wants to start asking any questions, that'd be great. Or if Mark and Jenny would like to continue with what they were saying. I don't know, Mark, you maybe cut yourself a bit short if you want to add anything to that while people are thinking about questions.
Yeah, I'm happy to. Thanks, Lindy, for that. Yeah, I must emphasise, I've worked nearly 40 years now, and dealing with bushfire and this particular issue of how you protect your asset and yet align fire management for the ecological or biodiversity outcomes, which I'm particularly keen on also. To me, it's almost, you have to tailor make it for each situation. There's no general rules. Like, I know the Royal Commission will bring us great data with a whole lot of recommendations, but you really have to look at each situation. Even within Ku-ring-gai, a certain valley, you should look at a certain valley and the houses around it. You could look at the southern side of Ku-ring-gai National Park. I'm up at St Ives Showgrounds up that way, so I'm particularly interested in that interface. And the other thing I really want to emphasise is the need for long-term monitoring, particularly on the biodiversity side. Even in Ku-ring-gai, there's no sort of plus 20-year, how would I say, biodiversity plots of how things go over time. Are there changes in the plant populations, in diversity, in animal abundance, local extinctions, those types of things? Because fire is a primary moulder of evolution, and plants and animals come and go depending on fire regimes. They are just so important. Actually, in the Northern Territory, they found a lot of their mammal declines have been due to too intense or too frequent fire, and that's been recognised. And they do burning, their hazard reduction burning now, really early in the fire season to prevent extinctions, further extinctions. So we need good data, and to do that, we have to do long-term monitoring. But what I'd really like to emphasise is that we might have all these recommendations coming out, but it needs the public to emphasise who's going to fund this. The public could pressure organisations. You know, we need money to do this. We need people, both money and people, to do long-term monitoring. So to me, it's critical. It's part of our life. And if we live in this beautiful leafy local government area, we have to look at the other side too, fire management, and really good appropriate fire management where, you know, it's paramount. And I'll leave you with that. But yeah, I'm pretty keen on what I do.
Thanks, Mark. Can I just hop in? There are some questions coming in, and just while you're on, there are some that should be directed to James and Jenny, but just while you're there, one from one of our is asking what burns are planned for this year. So maybe that's something that you could answer, Mark, and then Jenny and James could talk about some of the retrofit questions.
Yes. Yeah, actually, with our burn plans, we have what's called a Hornsby Ku-ring-gai Bushfire Management Committee, and RFF sits on it. Ourselves sit on it, National Parks and Wildlife, Main Roads and Crown Lands. And each year it's determined which burns will go ahead, and they're prioritised depending on the fire regime. You don't want them too frequent in an area, and also the risk factor, which are the risky areas at the interface. So I think at the moment we're developing 4 more burns for this season if we get an appropriate window to put them in. 2 of them are in Beechworth Avenue, that sort of area, over near Sheldon Forest. 2 are planned there. One's at Avondale, and there's another small one I think called Katani. So they're fairly small burns, but they're in very interesting places in terms of risk to try and reduce the fuel load in those risk spots. So it's part of my role also is to look at high risk spots and maybe where we can reduce fuel loads close to that interface area, because that really does assist in these lower to moderate intensity type wildfires if we do get them. And actually the season's really looking good now with the La Nina. So actually it might increase our burn windows also, because you need fuel moisture to put in a good hazard reduction burn. So yeah, I hope that assists a bit.
Can I just say, Mark, there was a hazard reduction burn over the weekend in Killara. Is that was one of yours, was it?
That was the National Parks one, actually, down in Garrigal, and it went fairly well. Yeah.
Good. Okay, thanks very much for that, Mark. James, do you want to answer some of these questions?
Yes, we have a question regarding retrofitting. So we had a presentation last week actually about retrofitting your home. That was done by an architect, Nigel Bell, an award-winning architect working out of the Blue Mountains, which everyone will know is very, very highly bushfire affected or at risk from bushfires. And his presentation was fantastic. It covered all the main areas that you could possibly want to look at in terms of retrofitting a house. Now, it seems like some of you might have missed that presentation, but do not be worried. The presentation was recorded and should be made available online. I think on the EnviroTube YouTube channel. Might be. I'll have to check that, but has been recorded and it is available for upload at some stage. Exactly when it will be made available, I'm not quite sure. Perhaps I can let Lindy know when it goes live, and then Lindy can, of course, let you know. So also following on from that note, we do have a bushfire retrofit rebate program. I've just shared a link via the chat. So if you are interested in bushfire retrofits, you can just go to the chat window now and click on the link to go to the bushfire rebate page. Otherwise, I can just very quickly show you what that page looks like and give you all a very quick rundown. because this is one thing you can, or everyone can do to lessen their risk from bushfires. Because as Mark said, in order to do a hazard reduction burn, you need a window of opportunity in order to do it safely and effectively, and reduce the hazard, but also not create a problem with an out of control fire. So sometimes, the conditions aren't right. So the focus should really be on residents as to what you can do to make sure you're prepared. Because as a key message that we talk about in our presentation is the shared responsibility. Council do everything it can do. The RFS will do everything it can do. And the community, you, need to do everything you can do in order to stay safe. And retrofitting your house is a major part of that. So again, council is here to help. So we have this bushfire-wise rebate program, and it's on the council website. So if you just search Ku-ring-gai bushfire rebates in Google or on the council website, you should find it fairly easily. Now, it's a 3-step process. Step 1 is to complete the Ready Check tool, which we briefly talked about before. You complete step 1, which is know your risk, where you map out your property and the risk that's affecting your property. And step 3, which is your property section. And then you do this step 3 and you download that and you upload that to your application along with a bushfire plan, which you can get from the RFS webpage. Again, there's links to all these web pages here. And then you make a rebate pre-approval. So down below, you can see under how to apply, you click the orange pre-approval application button. That will, in there, you enter your details, the kind of work you are thinking about doing, and then you'll have an opportunity to upload your bushfire plan and step 3 of the Ready Check that we discussed before. Okay, and then you'll submit that. It will come to me. I will have a look at it, and I will most likely request a quote for the work that you propose to do and some specifications. The reason why we do that is to make sure that both myself and you are on the same page as to what's being done, and just to guarantee that you will get the rebate afterwards. It's just a way of making sure that you are doing the right kind of work. For example, not using plastic gutter guards when you should be using metal gutter guards. Just, it's a quality check. That's the reason why we do the pre-approval application process. And then the final claim. Once you give them pre-approval, you can go do the work. You complete the work as outlined in your pre-approval, and then you make this application via the final claim, and you include your invoices, photographs, and evidence that the work has been completed as approved. And then the rebate is given out. Now the rebate covers 25% of the costs involved in the retrofit to a maximum of $1,000. Now some retrofits might require a CDC or DA, and for example, even a front door on a bushfire prone land might require a CDC. Okay, so that comes at a cost, and to help you get over that little hurdle, we're offering 50% of approval costs up to a maximum of $1,500 per household every 5 years. So, so in total, you can get up to $1,500 to go towards retrofit costs, and that is available to you once every 5 years. Now, I won't go through all the details here and what areas of the house are covered and what kind of actions there are. You can look at that yourself, but it covers pretty much the entire house. Okay, and there's also information there about whether or not you need development consent. If you have any questions, you can always call me and we can have a conversation, but it might be better off talking to customer service who can direct you to a planning officer who can help you determine whether or not you need a DA, CDC, or whether or not the work you propose to do is covered by the exempt and complying legislation. Okay, so that's my bit on the retrofit. So I hope that answers your question about retrofits and what they look like. So we have the video of the presentation of retrofits, and we also have the retrofit rebate program as well. So next questions.
Okay, that was very thorough. Thank you very much, James. I was just wondering if I'm not sure, the other ones was about an evacuation plans. Actually, is that something that we do, or is that something that the SES or RFS do, evacuation plans?
The evacuation plans are done by the LEMC, the Local Emergency Management Committee, and they won't say where the evacuation will be because until the fire occurs on the day, they can't really tell people which route to take or where to go. But what you will find out on the day is that the ABC 702 Sydney will be broadcasting continually with updates for people in areas that are being affected, whether to stay and defend, whether leaving is still an option, if they can leave, where they should go to if they don't have any plan to go anywhere. And they might even say which road to take, because they'll be able to say at any moment in time where that fire is at and what routes are available. So the RFS explains to people that they can't say in advance, but you can do your own planning, especially if there's one road in, one road out. It's a no-brainer. You're going to go that way. So the answer there, of course, is the earlier you leave, the better. But where you have multiple different routes, this is where your contingency planning comes in. Know them all. If you've got 3 choices, know the 3 choices quite well. And the conditions on the day will give you an indication as to which way to go. Go whichever way is the furthest from the bushland interface, and listen to the radio. Make sure you're complying with what they say about where to go and when to go. The other thing I should have probably add to that is that there's been a lot of research around people who do quite detailed planning, such as we have in climate-wise communities. And that is the ability to be able to draw on contingencies during the day. So as conditions change, as the fire develops, because there's no way of knowing how a fire will move beforehand. It's always a moment-by-moment matter. And so you've got to build into your plan contingencies that say, well, if this happens, this is what I do. If this happens, this is what I do. And what the research has found is that people who have these pre-planned, pre-rehearsed strategies fare much better in recovery, not only because they likely didn't get into such a crisis situation, but because they know how to manage the crisis when it occurs. And as a result, they incur far less post-traumatic stress disorder. Because people who manage to stay in control of a crisis don't go into that, I don't know what to do, this is beyond me, which is what happened a lot this last summer. People just said, nobody was telling me what to do. Well, that's probably going to be the case. Nobody will be there to tell you what to do. You need to be able to work it out for yourself, and it's that detailed planning in advance that's going to give you that ability.
Fantastic information, Jenny. Thank you very much. I hope people really take that on board. It's quite... we have had a couple of ones that were more directed to Mark, which was just about looking at fire trails and things like that and burns. But Mark, you're looking at the whole of Ku-ring-gai and judging where to next, aren't you? And I think that fire trails and APZs, they have a rotation too, don't they? Aren't they?
They do. Yep. APZs are often done on an annual or biannual basis, depending on resourcing again. But part of my role is to look as a newcomer, I suppose, with a fresh view at some of these pinch points or high priority risk areas and get them looked at. So I think the public has to realise we can't be everywhere at once also. It's called, I know everyone has their own backyard and they're concerned, but I've also got to look at overall priorities for the whole LGA. It's pretty important. So yeah, if people bear with that.
Yeah. So I guess, for example, can you just give us one? How are you prioritising areas? Is it, as you say, pinch points?
Pinch points, particularly, I'm really concerned about certain areas, long one-way in, one-way out roads, which have very high levels of bushland interface along them. And actually those are priority areas. Areas like North Turramurra, for instance, that's just pulling it out of my head, but you know, some areas through there, you know, in my view, would be pretty high risk, put it that way.
High risk.
And we're often left with a legacy of past, and I will say poor planning. I'm game enough to say that, because a lot of it has been poor planning or greed in the past also. So yeah, I'll say that. Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you. Thank you, Mark. One that Marjorie has mentioned, home water pressure. Is that something that either Jenny or James can?
Yeah, I can answer that one. The water pressure is not deliberately reduced. It's the water pressure drops during bushfire because everyone's using water at the same time. And the RFS, if there is a fire as well around, the RFS will be pumping water themselves to use on the fire. So when you have everyone drawing water, there's just less water around. So the water, so by nature, it would seem like the water pressure has been reduced. Also, a lot of people have questions about why can't they just increase the water pressure? Well, the water pipes are a certain diameter, and you can only increase the water pressure to a certain point before things start popping off left, right, and center, and you start having drips and leaks and bursts, water mains and stuff like that. And then you can't necessarily increase the diameter of the pipes, because that means digging up the entire suburb of Ku-ring-gai, the whole area of Ku-ring-gai, to increase the size of the pipes. So yes, water pressure is an issue, but that's because everyone's using water at the same time. And if you're at the very end of the pipeline, next to the bushland reserves, well, you're at the very end of the water supply, so you will probably be the last one to get any water. So we always recommend people to do not rely on having water to fight a fire. Have a rainwater tank or have a swimming pool, and have a diesel powered pump. This is if you plan on staying and defending. You know, we always advise don't hang around, get out before it's too dangerous. But if you are, you know, if your plan is to stay and defend, make sure you're well prepared with a pump, diesel powered pump with a large amount of water of your own water to use on the fire. And I'm sure Jenny, did I miss anything, or is there anything else you want to add to that?
No, that's pretty much it in a nutshell. Really, the only practical solution is to have your own water resource, as Jane said. And again, there's been people realising the value of sprinkler systems to go on the roofs. Nigel Bell was talking about this in his presentation as being probably the most effective way to reduce ember attack. And it's not that you want the sprinkler on the roof, you want it around the gutters so that it creates a curtain to prevent the embers getting in and through to the building. Depending, if you've got a tile roof, then you might want it on the roof, because the tiles can lift and the embers can get in the strong winds. But the value of having your own water supply hooked up to a sprinkler system that can be triggered remotely, that you don't have to be there. So through your smartphone, you can actually monitor when the fire front comes, or you can have a heat sensor that monitors when the heat comes up to a certain level and it triggers the sprinkler system going. So there's a couple of different ways that you can protect your house with that water supply that you've got without you having to be there.
And if I can just jump in one extra little bit, if you do have a swimming pool or a large rainwater tank, it's always very advisable to have a sticker at the front of your house. You will see that you have seen this around. It's an SWS sticker. Now, SWS stands for Static Water Supply. What that tells the RFS or the fire and rescue is that there is a amount of water that can be used to fight the fire. So if there's a fire next to you, if your house is on fire or there is a fire nearby, your neighbor's house is on fire, they can use your water to put the fire out, and thereby saving your house and saving your neighbor's house. So if you do have a rainwater tank or a swimming pool, make sure you get yourself a SWS sticker. You can order one from the fire and rescue, from your local fire and rescue brigade.
Oh, thanks for that. So we don't supply them, James. You have to actually.
Oh, I think we have a few knocking about the office. So if people want some, we can put them in a post and send them to you.
Okay.
But if we can very easily run out. So if we do, we'll let you know. And if you just want to get one directly, skip the middleman, which is us, go straight to Fire and Rescue, you can order a SWS plate. It's an actual metal plate you can bolt to the front of your house or to the fence, so that fire.
So anybody with a swimming pool or a rain tank or a pond, anything like that. Great.
Yeah, exactly.
That's good advice. Thank you. Well, I think we're up to an hour now. That's sort of whizzed by. I hope everybody's really enjoyed that, and I'm really glad we recorded it too, because this is, you know, it's for all those people that couldn't make it, it's just going to be such a great reference point. It probably has raised more questions for people. Sometimes people go away and they think about what they've heard, but I'm sure Mark, Jenny, James, quite happy for you to approach them by email. You can either direct them to me and I can forward them on to them. Any of your questions will be answered. But we, you know, really appreciated you joining us today, and thank you very much for our guest speakers, Mark, Jenny, James, for doing such a terrific job. And I think we'll end it there unless anybody else has got anything else they would like to say. Okay. Well, I'm going to finish off. I'm going to close the meeting now. So if everybody would just like, everybody can just go away, leave the meeting.